last couple of sessions. We had seen how God had restored us back to Him by the grace of His forgiveness. And after restoring, what is God's provision for us in sustaining us in that relationship that God had restored for us with Him? Last session, what we had looked at was God's protection and God's guidance in this world of evil and opposition. We have seen from the patriarchal stories, even though there were so many hurdles, so many evil opposition planned and schemed against many of them, but yet God in His providence had protected them and guided them to that end where He wanted to bring them. And if you look at John's Gospel, for example, in chapter 17, verse 15, here is Jesus praying for His disciples. Jesus said, "Father, I do not want you to take them out of this world, but rather protect them from the evil one." Now that is what Jesus prayed for the disciples then. And then in verse 20, Jesus said, "My prayer is not only for these disciples now, but all those people who would believe what they would say and follow me." And therefore the prayer that Jesus prayed that day is also for us who follow Jesus Christ. And therefore Jesus has already prayed that God should protect us in this world of opposition from the evil one, so that we will remain in faith. And therefore we should have that confidence, and we should have that faith in our God, who is always watchful and caring, and He is our protection. Today we are going to look at the second aspect of God's provision in order to keep us in this faith, in order to preserve us in this relationship. And that is to do with our special status that God has established through the covenant. And in the Exodus story, as the people had been delivered from Egypt, from their oppression, the people were not allowed by God to reach that promised land in a shorter route. There was a trade route that was running along the Mediterranean coast, which is called as the Way of the Philistines. If you read Exodus chapter 13, verse 17, God made it very clear that the people should not go through that road, but rather they should come to that place where God was going to make a covenant with that people. That was Mount Sinai. And chapter 13, verse 17, God made it clear, because these people, when they see hardship, when they see war, they may run away from the call that I have given them. Because these people are not yet ready to receive and to fulfill what God had promised. And they needed to be prepared. They needed to be guided. They needed to be protected. They needed to be shown as to the purpose for which God had called them into this life. And therefore God did not allow these people to go through that shorter route in order to reach the promised land. It would have taken only a couple of months for them to reach that Palestine. The second reason why the people were not allowed to go through that place is in chapter 3, verse 12. They had a divine appointment. They must go to the Mount Sinai, and where God will meet with them. Now that's a very significant understanding of God meeting with the people. It is a very significant meeting because there's going to be a covenant and there's going to be a moment where God would call them to commitment, because it is this covenant and commitment that would determine their very existence as God's people. The commitment that the people should have in the call that God had given to them, that is going to determine their future as to who they are. And we will talk about this commitment a little more, but this is the reason why God wanted them to come to Mount Sinai. Though it was going to be a very difficult journey, but yet God had a plan, and there was a divine appointment for the people to meet with God in that place. When they came to that place at Mount Sinai, they stayed there, they camped there for about 1.5 years, because God had to prepare these people. How did God prepare them? When you look at the covenant at Mount Sinai, it defined the relationship between God and God's people. And the defining statement is, I'll be your God and you will be my people. God's revelation of himself with mighty acts of deliverance has a very clear purpose toward God's covenant with the people. In other words, even before God had made a covenant with this people and called them to make a commitment, now God had to reveal himself to this people as to whom they are making the covenant with. The knowledge and the understanding of God is very, very important for them in order to trust and depend. And the reason God said when they see war, they will run away, and therefore let them not go through that shorter route, that is the way to the Philistine, is because there is not yet that commitment and the courage to depend upon God yet with the people, because they don't know God yet. Even though they had seen God at work in Egypt, the plagues were there, and they had seen how God, or the last plague during the Passover, how God protected the people who obeyed God and God's commandment. Even though they had all these experiences, but yet they were not ready for their commitment. And therefore, they should know the God of their fathers with whom they are making the covenant. The knowledge of God is very, very important. Knowledge of God is, in the Bible, it is not simply a cognitive understanding, but rather it is an experiential relationship. When someone tells me our God is a healer, yes, I have heard that he is a healer. But have I experienced him in my own personal life as a healer? Now that is what God is calling us to do. The knowledge of God means an experience with God as to what truths that we learn from the Bible that must be applied and experienced in our life. And therefore, what you are looking at here, the people of Israel, now delivered from Egypt, had not come to that point of a very clear experience of this God. And therefore, now God is going to take them through a very important phase of their life where they would experience this God. There will be a visible witness about the God that they are going to make the covenant with. And the first thing that we see as the people came out, they were led by the pillar of clouds and the pillar of light, both in the day and the night. And they could experience this God visibly, that God is going before them. They could see that. And they know that there is this God with them, and this God is a dependable God because he has been all along without fail in the night and the day. He was there with us. And therefore, that is a very important experience that the people had. And what actually clearly these things reveal to this people is that this God is not just one of the gods that the people around them they worship, but this God is the only God. And He's a creator God, creator of heaven and earth. The unique experience of this God as a creator. Because during the plagues in Egypt, God had controlled the nature. And God is the one who had used His nature in His favor and performed those miracles there. And now they could see how God has divided the great sea, the Red Sea. The people just walked through the sea like walking on the dry ground, that's how it says. Because it's a very unique experience upon the people. After they crossed this Red Sea, in Exodus chapter 15, there is a song which is called as a song of Miriam, because these people were praising and worshiping God, dancing before God, because of that unique experience they had in crossing that Red Sea. Because God had divided this Red Sea, which had no people ever experienced in their life. A very unique experience. You know how this song describes God? The song there in chapter 15 describes God as a warrior. What kind of a warrior? A warrior who fights for the weak and the helpless people. They were helpless. They were weak. They were not powerful, powerless people there in Egypt. But this God came to save this people from such kind of a yoke of the Egyptians and delivered them. And therefore their experience was, this is a God, a very merciful God. You can depend upon this God because He answers the cry of the weak and the helpless people. Now that's a God we have. A God, when we call upon Him, He could understand, He could recognize in our own life, the kind of the problems and the issues and the kind of a pressures that we go in our life. And therefore this God is ready to respond and ready to save us from that situation. This is a unique experience people had when they had seen this great miracle and they had walked through this miracle and God had delivered them and God had drowned also or defeated in the Egyptian army, one of the powerful armies of those days in the Red Sea. And therefore, they understood this God as a warrior, a God who fights for them. And this is a God fights for us also in our own life. When we face situations, oppositions, pressures from outside, and we can definitely depend upon this God because this God will fight for us. No power on earth, no evil forces can overcome us because we are in the safe hands of God. Amen? So that is a kind of a God they had experienced. Therefore, the song of Miriam that gives them that unique experience of this God as the only God. A God who is a creator, because the sea and the stars and the heavens and the nature, everything is the creation of this God, and everything is under the control of this God. And therefore, when they came to Mount Sinai, they camped there, as I said, for 1.5 years. And there also, before God made this covenant with them, they had an awesome experience with God. If you look at Exodus chapter 19, as a very descriptive statement about how God had appeared before people and how the people had witnessed this God. If I read a few verses from verse 9 onwards, and it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I shall come to you in a thick cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you." God said the people should have this experience. They should know, I have spoken to you. It is not Moses simply coming and telling the people this is what God said, but God told Moses, I'm going to make the people recognize the reality that our God is real and that God speaks. And therefore God said to Moses, I'm going to come in the clouds, and the people are going to visibly see that the Lord has come and I'm going to speak, and the people are going to hear the voice of God, and they will know that I have spoken to you. And it says, I'll speak with you and may also believe in you forever. The people will believe and trust in you. Then Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. The Lord also said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Consecrating the people. They should understand the kind of a God they are going to meet with. A holy God. A God who has no sin in him. When you come to worship this God, this is the God that we come to worship. What kind of a preparation? This is a preparation that God had told Moses to prepare the people to meet with him, consecrate them, make them understand who they are going to meet with. And the verses below, it also points out, let them not come near the mountain where I'm going to come down. They should not touch even that mountain. You set the boundary there. Because if anyone comes near and touches the mountain where I come down, and they will die. They should understand the holiness of God, the kind of a God they are meeting with. And therefore, God gave this very clear instructions to Moses to tell the people. And they are going to witness this one. And you can also see in verse 16, so it came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning, flashes, and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. When you talk about the fear and trembling in the presence of God. Now why? Because you see the awesome presence of God. Quite often we use these terminologies as we come to worship God, the awesome presence of God. But you need to understand what this awesome presence is, so that it will shake us from inside, the fear and the trembling. And God said, I'm going to come down in that fire and in the cloud, in the smoke that would be there upon that mountain. And the people, when they see visibly, there will be a fear in them. They will tremble before me. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. And the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So this is the appearance of God before the people, and the people's understanding of this God. And the knowledge of God gives them that faith and the assurance of God's call to be God's people. When God called them, I'll be your God, you will be my people, and God is calling them to make a commitment to be God's people. And can they trust this God? Can they depend upon God? Because in case of trouble, can we depend upon this God that he will deliver us from such a trouble? And you will find this is the same problem that these people faced and God himself faced. Even after all these experiences that they had with God, when it comes to Numbers chapter 14, where the previous occasion where the spies were sent into the land and they came back and gave a bad report about the land there, because there were people who are like warriors, and therefore they said, if we go and fight with them, we will die. We will be just like grasshoppers. They will just like fly killer, they'll kill us. We cannot go. And the people began to moan, they began to cry, they began to weep overnight. And if you read chapter 14, verse 11, the grouse that God against the people was this: how long can I be patient with this people? In spite of witnessing all those miracles that I have done with them in their presence, how long these people will refuse to trust me? How long these people will refuse to believe me? So this was the grounds of God. This is not just with the people of Israel. This continues even today, right? Trusting God at times of trouble, at times of pressures, at times of sickness, at times of death. We begin to question God. We begin to have doubts about whether God is with me or not. Whether God would do this thing for me or not. I have been praying and praying and praying for so many days, and God had not answered. Has God heard my prayer? Is God real? Is God dependable? All the words that I read in the Bible, is it true? And this is where it is not simply reading the Bible and the words of God, the words of truth, but that also must become our experience. Experience God. And therefore, this knowledge of God, knowing this God, is very, very important for our faith and assurance in order to be very committed to this God. And God had done this so these people will trust Him and depend upon Him. Secondly, knowing God makes them recognize the seriousness of the covenant. That it is not just a matter of temporary relief from bondage, that is a deliverance from Egypt, but a very serious commitment to live as God's people. Knowing God would make you to recognize the seriousness of the commitment. It is not a covenant, take it or leave matter. You agree today, and then you want to go by, and next day, because of certain other reasons, you want to leave God and go. And when you make a commitment, it is something serious because you are making a commitment with the God of heavens. When you read Ecclesiastes chapter 5, he is talking about prayer. And what he says, as an example, when you make a vow, God did not ask you to make a vow. But when you make a vow, remember, who did you make the covenant with? God is in heaven, you are at His footstool. And did God ask you to make a vow? He didn't. But you made a vow. When you make a vow, therefore, be sure to fulfill it. In other words, he is saying, don't play with God. Don't play with God. So that is what we are looking at here. The knowledge of God, the more you understand, the more you experience, the more you know God in your life, you become very serious about your Christian life, your commitment that you have made with God. When you're talking about baptism, 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 21, Peter tells you very clearly, it is a very serious commitment. What he's saying is, baptism is not simply taking bath, getting into the water and coming out, but rather it says it's a pledge of clear conscience toward God. It's a pledge. It is a promise. It is an appeal to God for a good conscience. With a clear conscience toward God, you pledge before God, I will be your child. I will be your people. I will do what you ask me to do. My commitment is real. And therefore, it is a pledge. It is a commitment that you are making. And therefore, baptism is not a ritual. Baptism is symbolically indicating your commitment to God. And therefore, you should take it very seriously. So also with marriage. If you look at Hebrews chapter 13 verse 4, it talks about honor your marriage commitment. You cannot therefore defile the marriage bed. God has a reason. God has given you a partner so that God's purpose will be fulfilled in your marriage relationship. And therefore, take that commitment very seriously. And therefore, making a commitment and taking the commitment very seriously comes by knowing your God. Quite often, we find we make many of this as a kind of a ritual. There has to be an inward seriousness of what we are doing. And when we come in the presence of God, let's understand He's a God in heaven. And as Ecclesiastes says, we are at His footstool. And therefore, let's not play a game with our God. He's a holy God. He's a God who comes in fire and thunder and clouds, and the whole nature is under His control. And therefore, that awareness of God, the knowledge of God, experience of God is very, very important. That's the reason why before God made this covenant with this people, God wanted to prepare them, to make them understand it is not just a game. There's going to be a very serious commitment you are going to make, and you are going to live by that commitment you are making. There is consequences if you don't live in that commitment you are making in God's presence. Seriousness is, there is consequences. And therefore, God wants to make this very clear. And therefore, faith and commitment to God is not superficial. It's not just kind of a ritualistic, but based on very definite and defined experience and knowledge of God.